Andrea, welcome to 10 Across Conversations. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really looking forward to this interview because I think it relates very precisely to the 10 Across geography, obviously, where you are, and we want to talk about that at the beginning. And today's discussion is going to have a lot to do with the impacts and unintended byproducts of all the things we want to buy that come often from abroad via ship, are trucked across the country, and the result of that is a considerable diminishment of air quality, especially in certain areas, especially the Inland Empire. So, Andrea, why don't we start with that? Tell us a little bit about yourself. And for those who don't know the Inland Empire, why don't you explain what it is?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Andrea. I am born and raised here in the Inland Empire. We're about an hour east of LA. We're like this collection of small cities along the 1060 freeway. A bunch of small cities, suburban, kind of rural. We're surrounded by like this beautiful mountains, and we're all in within a valley.
Mm-hmm.
And we're an area, we have like some of the largest populations of Latinos in the entire state of California. And we've actually been growing the number throughout the last couple of years. So it's a really growing population of people. A lot more housing has been built, and we're just seeing a lot more build out in this area, which used to be once rural and agricultural, has now become suburban or
Mm-hmm.
semi-rural. Um, yeah, that's the Inland Empire.
And so that's the location. And people who study California will note there are many Californias within California. I think we hear a lot about Silicon Valley and the wealth there. There's LA, there's the Inland Empire, and other agricultural areas in the state, some of whom have a lot of resources, some of whom don't. And so I think for people to understand the texture of California, it's not monolithic. And it's hugely important to understand this area. So a lot of warehouses have been built, and you've observed the impact on the community because of the trucking and or other byproducts of that situation. Describe that, and why you were awarded the Goldman Prize for the work that you're doing to try to help your community.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, yeah, because we're an hour east of LA, we're also an hour east of the largest port in the entire country, which is the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach. That port moves about 40% of the nation's stuff throughout the year. And because of the port and because of how much the port is growing as well, they want to like double in the next 10 to 15 years their capacity. You had to have created an inland port to basically deal with all of those containers of stuff that's coming in, mostly from Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what was kind of created in our community, the Inland Empire, is this idea of a dry port or an inland port, which could basically carry all those things off of rail and trucks and then ship them off into stores or ship them to other parts of the country. Because, like I said, 40% of the nation's stuff comes from here. So it's got to get to you somehow. It doesn't come off directly off the ship. There's actually
Mm-hmm.
this whole chain of logistics that has to happen. And so because of that growth, and also just the growth of online shopping, and not just the growth of online shopping, but also the growth of getting it the next day, right? That type of
Mm.
speed that we didn't once have 5 years ago, right? Now it's become super common that everyone wants to be like Amazon, right? Everybody can get you something the next day. We've that doesn't happen out of thin air. You need warehouses, you need trucks, you need trains, and you need all of that. So our region has over 1 billion square feet of warehousing at a point right now, which is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, you have about 500,000, a little over 500,000 diesel trucks that drive into and out of the region every single day, right? They have to get into our region to then get onto the 10 or the 60, and they go to the rest of the country
Mm-hmm.
with stuff. If not, they're going through trains. And so all these trucks, all these trains, all these warehouses, and all these airports has created a huge air pollution and public health crisis,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have some of the worst levels of air pollution in the entire country. It's some of the highest levels throughout the state. It's some of the highest levels throughout the entire country. Every single year, we get like an F grade from the American Lung Association, because we know there's super high levels of diesel particulate matter and other particulate matter coming straight off of the diesel trucks that are driving in and out every single day. It's like smoking a pack a day without ever smoking a day in your life, right? That's
Hmm.
how much air pollution people are breathing in. And so with air pollution comes health impacts, right? People,
Hmm.
especially those that live closest to the freeways, to the rail yards, to the airports, to the warehouses, they're the ones breathing this in with their bodies every single day.
I was about to ask you that very question.
Yeah.
How close do I need to be to a highway or a major thoroughfare with trucks on it where I'm feeling the significant impacts of that, and how far away can I be till I'm getting approximately normal air?
It's a really good question. Because yeah, some people live 50 feet behind these things,
Hmm.
behind a train, behind a freeway. And yeah, your impact is way higher. But
Hmm.
because of the wind patterns and also
Hmm.
the fact that we live within a valley,
Hmm.
air pollution just doesn't dissipate, right?
Right.
It does flow. And especially because our region is particularly hot, with the mixture
Right.
from the sun and pollution, you get this ozone layer that gets created, especially in our summertime. So we have some of our government agencies that say you need to be at least 1,000 feet from some of these truck pollution areas, right? To not be as impacted. But that data is outdated,
Hmm.
actually.
Hmm.
There's been studies that have come out that say um, might need to be like 1.5 meters away for not to not have the impact as much. Now, the problem here, though, is this idea of cumulative impact, because that might be you need to be 1,000 feet from one truck. But what happens when you are next to, a dozen trains
Hmm.
and 500 trucks in an hour, right? That impact grows every single time you add to it. Because we've built out this logistics system so much, you're not just hiding from one source of pollution. You have these multiple layers that get stuck up on it. So there was a study done about the rail yards in our communities like 15 years ago, and it showed that you could be miles away from the train yard and still be impacted
Hmm.
just because of how concentrated it is, how many trains are coming in, and how bad, how old the technology that they're using is.
So the escalated interest in commerce, online commerce, and particulate matter. There must be something showing how much it's increased over the past several decades. Because the trucks, I could be wrong about this, and I've heard about some different kinds of transportation. We know about some, but the trucks are essentially the same as they were. There have been some improvements in capturing some of what's coming out of them. But is there a relationship between the escalation of shopping, the escalation of particulate matter?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, next day delivery doesn't happen without these trucks. And so the fact
Hmm.
that in the last 5 years, we've seen the growth of that, we've seen a huge uptick of thousands of more trucks on the road. And you're right, the trucks haven't changed too much. In California, we've been able to pass certain laws that have, you have to put some type of reefer into
Hmm.
where the exhaust comes, right, to capture
Right.
some of it. But you're still dealing with diesel engines that are
Mm-hmm.
still emitting diesel particulate matter out of the tailpipe.
Mm-hmm.
So even with this, we know that there are still significant levels of air pollution, and that's just in California. We also get a lot of trucks from out of state that are coming in because they have to bring and move things. So we're not always dealing with California standardized trucks. We're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with all types of trucks from different states.
So I mentioned in passing earlier, and probably too quickly, that you were the recipient of the Goldman Prize, which is awarded to people who are taking ownership of issues like this in their communities and making a difference. You're a relatively young person. How
Thank you.
did I can tell you I've got multiple laps on you. How did you decide this is something you wanted to do? You had the capacity to do it. You could build up the community support to achieve this. What was that moment where you said, I'm just not going to watch this happening in my community?
Yeah. So my personal journey was that I grew up in this region. My parents work in the industry. I know the industry very well. If you're in the IE, you know somebody who's a warehouse worker, a truck driver. You also probably know someone that has asthma and that
Mm,
deals with health issues as a consequence of their environment, right? So my story is not very different from others in the Inland Empire either. Most people get involved because of their family and their friends, right? And they see how this could directly affect them. In my case, I was extremely worried because, when your family works in places like this, they're the first, they're the first line of defense, right? They're the ones really having to breathe this on 8 hours, 10 hours a day. And so picking up on those things, I thought it was really important that, folks need these jobs. These are dignified jobs, they're important jobs, but how can they be safe jobs as well? Because we're always kind of getting told it's either one or the other. Either get jobs or you get the environment, which is a really bad deal. You could do both at the same
Hmm.
time. It's
Hmm.
totally possible. We innovate things all the time. We could do this. And so that was my journey. And so that's how I got involved. And I really got involved and was taught by so many other people in the region who had been doing this a lot longer than I have, because this movement to zero emissions, this movement around air quality from the goods movement system has been going on for decades before me. I mean, there have been groups, community groups in the IE and then all over the state, really, all over the state and the country who have been talking about diesel death zones for decades. And so I really learned from them. And I also think like once you take off those rose-colored glasses, you can't really put them back on again, right? Like once you bear witness, you bear a
Hmm.
responsibility. And so
Hmm.
that was my journey. And thankfully I came into a community that had been organizing around this for a long time. And so we spent the last couple of years continuing to build out our community, our organization around these issues. And together we were able to take on the trucking industry, right?
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
rail yard industry. And we got involved with state policies because a lot of our locals are not doing what they
Hmm.
should be doing and trying to protect our communities. So where do we need to go? We need to go to the state. I mean, these are systemic issues that we need to address. And so thankfully, by the time I got involved, work at our California Air Resources Board had been done to make
Hmm.
sure that they were going to create a zero emissions rule. And
Hmm.
so we got involved and we do what we think is really important, which is you take the people that are most impacted to the places of power so that they can have a decision in these places. Because a lot of times it's people in Sacramento or in our courthouses, government buildings who decide the fate of these communities, never
Hmm.
having anybody from those communities involved. So
Hmm.
it is as simple as bringing the experts, who are the people that live at the front lines, to these places so they can directly tell their stories and directly tell you the solutions that they need. Um, yeah.
And I should mention you're the co-founder of the People's Collective for Environmental Justice. So you have an
Hmm.
organization. I've noted that you've toured representatives from state government to your area to actually show them what you're describing, because probably it's the case that many had never been to the Inland Empire or seen what you're describing. Um, Tell us, before you go on anymore, a little bit about your educational background and how that might have equipped you to take this on.
Um, my educational background, I went to college in UC Riverside,
Hmm.
local university. I
Which,
didn't
by the
study.
way, UC Riverside is part of the University Innovation Alliance with ASU. So we're big fans
Awesome.
of Riverside.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I didn't study environmental studies though. I studied global studies. I think I was really interested
Hmm.
in international politics, and maybe that's why, I was keen to understand how our local environment is so impacted by the global system of trade.
Hmm.
But like I think many of us who are in this movement, like a lot of us don't come in it with like this environmental background. I think a lot of us come in it through just like a public health, wanting something better. And then you
Right.
realize the environment is such a big part of it. Um, Now that I understand that, yeah, I could totally call myself an environmentalist. But if you would ask me in college, I probably wouldn't have claimed that.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's like that learning process. You learn that actually your environment is your life, and then you understand, well, who's creating your environment, your built environment, and it goes back to politics. And so yeah, that was, I think, my trajectory. A lot of stuff was either self-taught or taught by other people in our community who had taught themselves. And I think that's what we do in our organization as well, is kind of get the little that we know and we share it, and then other people bring in what they know, and we're able to build this like collective knowledge.
We often say that the Tenor Cross Project is about combining lived experience with the data
Right.
that confirms what you think you're observing or what you're feeling or the health effects. Uh, in your case, lived experience is profoundly important. I mean, you went to school in the neighborhood, quote unquote, in the community nearby, so you've seen this for your entire life. So you've made progress. The Goldman Prize, other recognition from Time Magazine. And then we have a new administration
Mm.
who would seem not to value what we all collectively are pushing for with regard to environmental justice, which is perfectly appropriate, I think. Tell us how you're feeling at the moment based on the pullback of some of the things that you've set in place and what you're doing to manage that.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge disappointment to see that the years of work by community members has been kind of taken away that fast. I mean, folks took off work, folks got babysitters, people got,
Mm,
took time out of their day to go to these meetings, right? Sacrifice parts of their life because they believe in something better. So all of that time and effort that community members put in, I think it's hard to be like all of that was for can so quickly be taken away. There is, I think, a huge sentiment of just disappointment. But at the same time, like we knew that this wasn't there was no silver bullet. The journey to see zero emissions and to see justice is a longer one that we do
hmm
realize. And so this does feel like a little bit of a pullback, but I think we're gearing up to go back even stronger than before, figuring out ways that we can either focus more hyper locally to get our cities and governments to understand the importance of protections for neighborhoods, but then also statewide, right? We're in California. How do we use the state of California as a way to advance some of our protections statewide? I think is the other thing that we're thinking. I do want to clarify, although the Trump administration is trying to attack our advanced clean truck rule and some other rules, they never got a chance to actually deal with the advanced clean fleet rule and the in-use
hmm
locomotive rule because the Democratic administration's EPA never gave us the waiver. So I say this because I do think that the Democratic administration also needed to do more
Hmm.
around trucking federally. There was a little bit of a gap. They should have worked faster and harder on these issues of air quality from the goods movement system. And so when we, as we're gearing back up for any future administrations, like it's equally important that both of them take this on seriously because we can see the repercussions we have today, which is now they're trying to take away California's authority,
Yeah.
and, all these ridiculous things. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you pointed that out because my comments are not directed at individuals. It's
Hmm.
more about how does government work. And California, as you well know, has been noted for setting air quality standards with regard to emissions and vehicles and things. And the California Air Resources Board would have been part of that, but they pulled back as well shortly after the recent inauguration. So you would think if you were going to be in a state to advance the ideas that you are, California would be the ideal place for it. Not only is the trucking there and the shipping and the ports and everything, but also a legacy of often being out in front of these issues. So I would think maybe some of your, if you want to call it disappointment, is probably at the state level. Would that be fair? Or would you put it a different
No,
way? Okay.
I would put it differently because CARB, our California Air Resources Board, they voted unanimously for the rules that we won.
hmm
They voted for it unanimously. Then the process was it needs to go to the EPA and they need to do the final approval. It got stuck at the EPA level, right?
Okay.
There should have been movement from Reagan, who was the head of the EPA at the time, to approve these waivers so we could get them, then be able to fight them well. I don't think California went in and pulled them prematurely. I think they in a way had to pull them because I mean, we know that Trump, this current administration was going to be attacking them.
hmm So that's what I was describing. The California pulling a bit, as you point out, it's for reasons that are not just black and white there. They're
Yeah,
observing the context.
yeah,
Okay.
totally. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So the vehicles themselves, I think there's been a push in California towards electrification. We actually have spoken with people in the trucking industry. Uh, Given that 10 across moves people 2,400 miles across the country, and thus trucking is hugely important. And with regard to California, we had one company who I think is really, I want to believe, well meaning, said there was a bit of all or nothing with California. Let's move right to electrification. And it was their perception that that's really hard and very expensive, and they put a lot of money into it. A hybrid situation might have actually achieved more in both the short and maybe longer run to get us to electrification. Have you heard that argument, and any thoughts about the vehicles themselves?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this actually.
Great, great.
Yeah. So any type of technology transition is hard. There's a lot of different players. You have the drivers, you have the companies that have to buy them, and then you have the manufacturers, right?
Hmm.
And I think what government policy tries to do is stimulate the market at the end of the day. How do we help incentivize a transition? How do we help phase out certain transitions that we know we need to, like fossil fuels? And so I think when people say that California tried to go all or nothing, I think it had to do a lot with like the headlines that the news was saying, which was like, there's going to be a ban on diesel and you won't be able to buy, which wasn't completely true, right? Uh, for one, the advanced clean truck rule was basically that the manufacturers had to start selling electric trucks. Not 100% from one year to the next, but they had to start selling them
Hmm.
little by little so that people could start test driving them and using them, right? The other rule we passed was the advanced clean fleet rule, which was, companies that have 50 trucks or more would have to slowly start transitioning
Hmm.
their trucks. People
Hmm.
left that piece out.
Hmm.
50 trucks or more. So if you have 2 to 3 trucks, you weren't going to be regulated under this.
Hmm.
You would still
Hmm.
be able to drive your diesel trucks. So, I think sometimes it's hard with, how do you get these complex policies into like, how do you teach someone about a complex policy in just like a headline is really hard. But there was a little bit more to that. People thought through what these meant. The thing about the bridge fuel and this way to go hybrid, I think something that's really important to us is how do we not elongate the lifespan of diesel? We know how
Hmm.
much it hurts local communities. We
Hmm.
also know how important it is for fossil fuels to get out of the use of fossil fuels. Um, so having some type of bridge fuel just like makes that end date longer. And it also leaves a lot of stranded assets. People said, why don't we go hybrid? Why don't we go natural gas? Why don't we try hydrogen? It's kind of these like guinea pig
Hmm.
type
Hmm.
fuels. All that does for us is keep certain EJ communities guinea pigging, trying out these new things, and still have diesel in their communities.
Hmm.
And I think my one last thing I'll say is that the manufacturers have a lot to do with the price of these trucks, how efficient they are, and how they work. So
Hmm.
in Europe, the manufacturers are selling big big rig trucks, diesel trucks, or not diesel trucks, big rig trucks that carry big containers that have ranges of 600, 700 miles. But here in the US, they don't sell those kinds of trucks. In Europe, they sell them for like 1/3 of the cost. Manufacturers here sell those same trucks for like 2 to 3 times the cost.
You're talking about electrified trucks.
Electrified
Yeah.
trucks. Talk
Yes.
about electrified trucks. So, and that has a lot to do with how Europe has really attacked price gouging and how they've
Hmm.
really, made some significant
Hmm.
policies to make sure that the consumer has, their rights as well. In the US, we don't have as much as that. We still have
Hmm.
manufacturers that are able to sell two different products in two different parts of the world, right? And they'll listen to kind of the manufacturers will listen to the timelines and deadlines in Europe for some of these electrification movements, but say, oh, that's totally unfeasible in the US. There's no way. So I think it's important for us to like also look at how that sometimes looks differently and how the US can also implement these types of changes on the same timelines that Europe has. We just need to be talking about how do we do it? Like, how are we
Hmm.
prioritizing our money to fixing up the grid, to electrifying the 10
Hmm.
corridor, the 5
Hmm.
corridor, like those types of things. Like, and I think in the last administration, we got some of that. Like, we had some plans for electrifying corridors. There was
Hmm.
money that's going to be put into it. So, unfortunately, there was a lot of momentum, and there seems to be a little dip in the momentum, but it doesn't matter. These plans were created, these studies were created. So I think we're in a good place to just get them moving. And hopefully the market also has been stimulated enough. There are a lot of people interested in building out electric chargers and manufacturing these trucks. So I hope to see that this doesn't halt the progress all the way. I
Hmm.
think we're going to see these businesses continue to try to move the transition.
So, for someone who's as close to this issue and describing what you just did, well, why does this work in a different governmental arrangement in Europe and appears not to be working as quickly or as efficiently here? And again, I'll reference Ezra Klein's book, which talks about the role of government and, let's say, the electrification of highways and how, frankly, less was accomplished than was intended, given the amount of money put in infrastructure. So if you step back from it, you're learning a heck of a lot about how this country works at the community level, at the state level, at the federal level. Your observations when someone says, oh, that couldn't happen here, what they're describing is what others have, which is a little bit of either dysfunction or we're trying to make everything perfect and we don't get the progress we need to get towards the ultimate end that we want. What would you say about what you observed about government, regardless of this particular topic?
Hmm. Yeah, I think government's hard. I think there's a lot of bureaucracies, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of like elongating a process to get it to happen. And I think
Mm-hmm.
in a country where, innovation is super important, like we're able to send people up to the moon now whenever we want.
Mm-hmm.
But you
Mm-hmm.
tell me we can't get diesel out of trucks,
Right.
right? Like sometimes I'm thinking the priorities are all wrong sometimes, right? I believe government's purpose is to serve its people,
Uh-huh.
right? And if its people is hurting and have health issues, that should be a priority of whatever government is in place.
Yeah, I think some regulation was well-meaning when it was put in place and slows
Uh-huh.
decision-making down such that we don't
Uh-huh.
rush to a solution and maybe take a considered look at the impact on people, on the environment, on the business, and other things.
Mhm.
And some of those things were probably put in place now maybe have become too cumbersome, but were well-intended.
Mm. Mhm.
Have you seen that?
I think so. I think we're seeing a lot of like polarization on some of these needs to transition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you've seen like it's totally undoable, and then you have people that are like, this is the only way we have to do it. I think the underlying issue here, at least for the climate stuff, is that like we are on a timeline.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Transportation emissions is the largest contributor to emissions when it comes to climate change in the US. The
Mm-hmm.
US
Mm-hmm.
has a huge responsibility for climate change. So,
Right.
if you want to change the system, we have to take some rough approaches. I think the thing is that policy should be made with a lot of people in mind. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's why we talked about, well, what are the incentives that are needed? What is the infrastructure that's needed? What does the market need? I think sometimes you're right, the rush to perfection is what gets us. I think the idea of these policies I think it was studied enough that the transition would be able to move with these policies.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be hard no matter what. We are going to have some cases and examples that maybe just didn't work, but that's what teaches us what will work, right? And I think the
Mm-hmm.
problem is like we're making sure everything's going to be perfect before we pass something is also going to we might never get there. I think there's a lot of examples in other countries of ways we've electrified rail, we've
Mm-hmm.
electrified corridors that we could learn from. That could very much work here.
Yeah. Just rail alone's a major topic in California that we could
Oh,
spend
yeah.
a long
So,
afternoon on. But so again, you were recognized for the work that you're doing by very significant institutions. If you will, what do you think they saw in what you're doing? Because as you've just pointed out, and we're observing, it isn't always the outcomes. It's moving towards an intended outcome, but sometimes you hit a little bump in the road, and maybe that's what we're going through right now. But people observed what you're doing was absolutely necessary. What do you think they saw in your work from, as I'll again reiterate, not somebody who's been doing this for decades, but who's been living it for decades, but then decides to take on a challenge?
yeah, I think what they saw was a community voice. I think a lot of organizers in this movement have talked over and over about how the expertise of those that have lived experience and how they should be in rooms and they
Mm,
should be deciding. And I don't think it's something that has always happened. I mean, environmental justice was barely recognized, probably the last administration, right? But has been happening for a long time. And so I would like to think that I think my example is an example of a lot of people in our region and across the country, it is everyday people who should be involved in policy work. It isn't people
mhm,
that have studied this or whatever. It's people that have just lived it and should be in the rooms and should be taken as equal as any economist, as any scientist, as anybody. And so I
mhm,
would hope that that's maybe the reason why they were able to shine a light on our work because
mhm,
it really is everyday people that came together or continue to come together to try to who
mhm.
want to see a better future for themselves.
And before we started this recording, in just some casual discussion, we were talking about how students that we observe really want to find
Yeah.
meaningful ways to engage these issues. And you would seem to be exemplary in that regard. And you mentioned that you talk to a lot of students. What are those conversations like? Because I'm sure they're looking to you as a role model.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to have students reach out and say that they're doing like a report on our work or they saw a video, and they're using quotes that, community members have said or I have said. It's really nice. We didn't expect it. But at the same time, I think I did the same thing as I do my work. I always look beyond our region. Like so many examples from the LA region of people that have been doing this for a really long time, asking for zero emissions. I've always looked to their stories for inspiration and quotes to help keep our work moving. Just as we looked at other past civil rights movements, the fight of Indigenous Americans, right? Like we look to these stories for lessons learned. And so I think yeah, I think what that's what it feels like. And I think right now is a good opportunity to keep sharing this narrative because it should become like a paradigm shift that
Hmm.
anybody, including a student, can be involved, right?
Hmm.
We talk about how these impacts of climate change will really affect the next generation the most harsh, and so
Hmm.
they should have a big say in
Hmm.
what happens. And so it's good to see them getting really
And I think what you're describing as you related to other, either the civil rights movement or other things of equivalent impact, success isn't overnight, and
right.
there's progress. Two step forward, maybe one back, two forward. That's what you should be prepared to engage in. I assume you would tell students, not the early win, and then you're done with that and you move on. And that's a different kind of
Yeah.
career outlook, but someone like yourself can convey that to folks.
Yeah, that it's definitely a marathon. It's not a sprint, and you're gonna have highs and you're gonna have lows, but our communities are really resilient, and um we have nothing but be optimistic in these times,
Hmm.
right? Like although we have a lot going on, we also need to maintain our joy, our happiness, and all of these things because it is a long fight. And if we're just fighting against something, then we're gonna tire ourselves out. I think fighting for something and fuels people. And we see that hyper locally too with people that are fighting against warehouses in their backyard. They're fighting for their community. They're fighting for
Mm.
what they believe they should see. And that kind of stuff is going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of different types of skill sets. So it's like you don't need to be a singular type of activist, right?
Mm.
Like you can be an artist, you can be a chef, you can be, an awesome communicator, you can be a teacher, a lawyer, whatever it might be. Like you need a little bit of everything. And so that's what I think. We hope to convey to people too is like everyone can be a part of this.
I'm sure my producer would say that is a great way to end a very good conversation. And we might do that. We might do that. But let me ask one more. As you look for
Okay.
a vision to the future,
Okay.
so much of it depends on, sounds excessively technical, but it's not. It's electrification. I mean, the port needs to be electrified. The trucks, you've mentioned rail. Now the stress on the grid is becoming more profound because of data centers and other large volume structures, which make it really hard to build a community. Um, but a lot does revolve around energy and electrification of so much of our lives. As you look at the future, is that how you see it as well? And could you begin advocating for things adjacent to what you're trying to solve in the Inland Empire?
Thank you for asking that. It's really important. I think it's hard. It's a very nuanced question because I think some people have this phrase of just like let's electrify everything. And yeah, in some degree, yes. How do we get on renewables? How do we get on this type of energy system? The problem though is like we also can't put like a battery on absolutely everything. Like we also can't be consuming and throwing things away at the rate that we are. Like we as a society cannot like if not that'd be like a greenwash solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Mm-hmm.
something I get very fearful because even though diesel is really important to get out, it's also equally as important to make sure that we're not mining the heck out of our communities either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially those communities in the global south, especially the communities here in the
Mm-hmm.
Salton Sea close to us.
Right.
So Really, the core of this is how do you create a more efficient goods movement system that gets everybody their needs in a way that's way more localized? How are we giving opportunities to entrepreneurs to be able to
Mm,
source things more locally?
mm,
California gets a lot of its food already locally. How are we
mhm,
creating that across the
mhm,
state? How
mhm,
are we creating ways that our medicine, our goods, things for fun are being more sourced locally as much as we can so we can have less of a need for it. I don't think
mhm,
that expanding absolutely everything and then electrifying everything is the solution either. I think we need to figure out how to make just a more sustainable, localized communities. And I think we can do that, right? I think the issue right now is that like everything is the tone and the pace is being set by corporations who only care about making money, right? And you
mm,
talk about the Amazons, the Walmarts of the world, they're not worried about you meeting your needs. They're worried about how much you consume and can you consume more and
mhm,
can you make this the system more profitable? That's stuff I think we need to be really concerned about. We need to be
mhm,
figuring out how do we need to be consuming all this and are there ways to keep the lifespan of our stuff longer? Because
mhm,
that comes to the core of it, which I think is two-sided. I think there's like a consumer side, like yes, us as individuals, we need to be maybe a little bit more critical of what we're shopping and how
mhm,
much we are. But then on the other side, we also have corporations that are feeding our algorithms.
mhm,
You know, we're seeing brick and mortars close down. Like options are getting smaller and smaller for folks to be able to localize their consumption. So how are we challenging those corporations as well? Because that's driving us into a future that is very unsustainable.
mhm. Well, I think what you're pointing out to conclude is that one can learn a lot by the situation that's right on your doorstep. It's in your
Yes.
hometown, in your background. And if you look really closely at that, you begin to understand the larger context that
Hmm.
creates that circumstance and then the possibility of addressing that. Um, any last thoughts for our audience?
Um, any last thoughts? I guess just I think this system of how we get our goods is pretty invisibilized. Like, I don't know how much we think about who are the people behind
Hmm.
the ones that get us our food and our
Hmm.
goods, who are the
Hmm.
people that are driving those goods to us, who are the people that are moving those things, a very invisibilized sector. And it's a really important sector. And we wouldn't have our medicine, food, et cetera, without them. So just want to uplift what an important system this is and the workers behind it, and also the communities that are behind it as well. Because without these communities that make it happen, we wouldn't. So
Right.
how do we just make sure that I think all folks are asking is, this is a system we all benefit from. How can we all equally share the burden? If there
Hmm.
has to be a burden associated, or how do we just get rid of the burden for everybody?
So fortunately, we have some navigators and observers like yourself, who, as you mentioned, these are the people that you live with. These are
Hmm.
your family members and others, making all of this available to us to understand and hopefully act upon. So, Andrea, I want to thank you very much for all of your insights today. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I guess my one last plug is just to follow the People's Collective for Environmental Justice
Okay.
on all social media platforms. It's at PC4EJ.
So we will put that in the show notes so people
Perfect.
see that as well. And anything we can do to promote your activities, we're happy to do that.
Yay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.